Not too long ago, it was polar battles between hawks and doves that most clearly divided conservative and liberal thinking. Today, such antagonisms are more often replaced by polarization that separates us around social issues, but depending on world circumstances, the way right and left can polarize with questions of war and peace could easily once again move to the fore and dominate the partisan debate. Because of all it has to teach in my recent book, Perspective and Guidance for a Time of Deep Discord, I use this particular polarity as a point of departure. I've described how I wrote the book because of deep concern I feel about how issues of every sort today are dividing almost immediately into polar camps. Often with particular issues, it is not at all clear in advance that there is any reason for conflict. All we know is a division will happen eventually and result in absolutist advocacy from both sides. Conflict between ideological factions today has become so pronounced that real conversation about a great many issues has become largely impossible. Extreme polarization is setting neighbor against neighbor, creating distraction that gets in the way of addressing essential questions, and often very directly putting us at risk. Over the last couple of decades, we've seen such reactive polarization become ever more pronounced and people's voices becoming ever more shrill. A simple lesson provides the architecture for the book. In times past, when we encountered polarized positions and partisan advocacy, our task was obvious and unquestioned. We assumed that there were only two outcomes and that our job was to figure out which one was right and fight for it. As we look to the future, polarization has very different implications. We recognize that what we are seeing is left and right hands of a larger systemic picture, and the fact of polarization alerts us to the fact that we have yet to ask the hard questions that ultimately need to be addressed. When we succeed at asking the larger question, we see that there have always been more than just two sides. We also see that while each traditional side may hold a piece of the truth, neither side by itself nor just some averaging of polarities can get us where we need to go. Moving forward effectively will require bringing greater maturity and more encompassing perspective to how we make sense of our worlds and how we make choices. I started the book by looking briefly at the question of a few episodes back, why we see such extreme social and political polarization. I then turned to addressing what the needed greater maturity of understanding looks like when applied to political concerns where divisiveness too often prevails. Those were war and peace, climate change, health care, abortion, immigration, bigotry, the relationship of science and faith, and conflicting views on the nature of progress. My intent with these various topics is not to provide policy solutions. Rather, my hope is that what I can say will help illustrate the importance of cultural maturity's changes and culturally mature understanding. In fact, the ability to get at least a toe into culturally mature territory will be needed for what I say to make real sense. But we can also think of each topic as an exercise in building the necessary conceptual muscles. I begin the book's more topic-specific observations where I do, in part because the war and peace polarity, or expressed more politically hawks versus doves, is where the inability to reconcile differences could most easily lead to our demise. But I also start there because of how the topic sets the stage for addressing the concerns of later chapters. Of particular importance, as I outlined in the earlier episode on complexity and uncertainty, it helps us answer the important question of just how the polarized thinking of times past has served us. It further supports the conclusion that the fact of polarization has more to do with how we think than what we think. It also helps us with understanding how it might be legitimate to feel hopeful as we look to the future. In the earlier episode, I described how historically we've tended to divide our world into allies and enemies, chosen people and evil others. I also described how, while chosen people, evil other thinking can have less than pleasant consequences, in the past it has benefited us. Most immediately, it has protected us from a major portion of life's easily overwhelming complexities and uncertainties by reducing a multifaceted, multi-hued, often contradictory world to a more manageable black and white. Chosen people beliefs have also provided a secure, unquestioned sense of collective identity. But as important as understanding the benefits of seeing our world in ally versus enemy terms is recognizing that continuing to do so has ceased to be an option. With weapons of mass destruction more and more available not just to nations but to rogue states and terrorist groups, the possibility of catastrophic outcomes has never been higher. And the fact that addressing so many of the most critical challenges ahead for us as a species will require global cooperation, such as climate change, divisive economic disparities, and the risks of pandemic, to name just a few, further amplifies the risks of thinking in ways that separate the world's people into opposing camps. If we are to have a world that works for anyone, it is essential that we learn to relate collectively in more mature ways. Our historical need for us versus them thinking brings us back to my assertion in the previous chapter, in a previous episode, that polarized beliefs have to do not just with what we think, but how we think. There I used as evidence the example of how often wars are less the result of major differences than we might assume. Once us versus them dynamics are set in motion, they easily take on a life of their own. Our historical need to think in us versus them terms also helps us better understand the process that produces what we see. When we divide our worlds into allies and enemies, we identify with an idealized part of our whole box of crayons complexity and project an unconscious negative part onto others. The absolutism we bring to how we view both our own kind and those we denigrate becomes predictable from this cognitive mechanism. These recognitions give us the book's beginning topic-specific chapter its essential overarching question. That question, is it possible to have social identity without having enemies? Many people would argue that getting beyond chosen people, evil other thinking is essentially not possible, that we evolved to be warlike, and that is that. Given today's realities, if this is the case, we can stop our inquiry right there. We are doomed. Creative systems theory argues that fortunately this is not the case. It proposes that at least the potential to take needed further steps is built into what makes us human. The theory proposes that the ability to get beyond thinking of identity in chosen people, evil other terms, follows directly from how developmental processes work. More specifically, it follows from cultural maturity's notion of a now possible cognitive growing up. With cultural maturity's cognitive changes, we become newly able to leave behind projective dynamics, and with this, to engage relationships of all sorts from a more whole person, whole system place. When we do, we come to see our past need for chosen people and evil others as something that may once have been developmentally important, and whose heroic stories we can still legitimately look back on and value, but that today, along with putting us at risk, also get in the way of being fully who we are. Reflexively viewing the world in ally and enemy terms comes to feel like a historical artifact, and a dangerous one. In how we have allied in hawks versus doves warring camps in times past, we find added support for the conclusion that what we see has more to do with how we think than in fact what is the case. If we step back, we recognize that there is no absolute line dividing more aggressive and more diplomatic approaches on the world stage, only the line that we make in our thinking. And the particular beliefs in the right and left provide further hints as far as what moving beyond moving forward necessarily involves. Neither the right nor the left, nor just a position somewhere in between, is capable of producing the needed whole person, whole system perspective. The right, certainly in its more simplistic manifestations, has a hard time getting beyond a narrow nationalism, and the left too easily just sides with peace, fails to recognize what real peace requires, and too readily becomes, in its own way, just as polemical and ideological. I remember confronting the importance of grasping a larger picture in my early 20s when opposing the Vietnam War. I recognized then that while I was very much against the war, I was not ultimately anti-war. Historically, we have been put at risk both by leaders who have been too quick to go to war and by leaders who have hesitated when strong responses were needed, as with the rise of fascism during the Second World War. As we look to the future, the risks associated with each kind of failing become multiplied many times over. It is clear that we live in times in which war at any scale has simply become untenable. But it is just as clear that any kind of peace that can work going forward requires an ability and a willingness to defend that peace. What culturally mature leadership provides is the ability to make the necessary, often highly nuanced and systemically complex decisions and do so wisely. The kind of thinking needed to effectively engage questions of war and peace requires that both the right and the left, as we have known them, surrender familiar assumptions. And at the same time, as we would predict, it also draws on the best of sensibilities from both sides. There are no's and yeses all the way around. The no to the right emphasizes that having enemies can't continue to work as a means of self-definition. The yes to the right affirms that local identity is important and can continue to exist only with protection. The no to the left emphasizes that focusing only on peace ignores the importance of standing for essential values and the role of boundaries in the healthy functioning of systems. And the yes to the left affirms the power of diplomacy and the importance of a more encompassing picture of identity. The challenge of getting beyond us versus them thinking on the global stage also provides good illustration of the importance of how cultural maturity's changes make possible essential new skills and capacities. In Perspective and Guidance for a Time of Deep Discord, I delineate how each of those I've noted, a willingness to take on a more ultimate kind of responsibility, greater comfort with complexity and uncertainty, the ability to better tolerate limits, and the understanding that truths of all sorts exist in a context are pertinent. The claim that it might be possible to leave the proclivities that have historically led to war behind us is radical and legitimately controversial. But if the concept of cultural maturity is correct, doing so reflects a natural next chapter in our human story. It asks only that we engage ourselves, our worlds, in new, more systemic, all the crayons in the box ways. Understood in this sense, the needed new steps become not just possible, but ultimately quite common sense. Again, I invite your thoughts and questions.